The pharmacy gate came down on my wife's hand at 9:47 in the evening. And the worst part wasn't the sound. The sound was bad enough, a fast metallic rattle, the security shutter dropping in its tracks. And then a single, dull note, when the steel found the obstruction of her fingers and the motor strained against it. But the worst part wasn't the sound. The worst part was that Dana didn't scream. She just looked at me through the slats of the shutter. 3 of her fingers caught under the steel at the second knuckle. And she said very quietly, "Mark, the lights just went out across the whole block." Not "help me," not "it hurts." Not even a sharp breath, though I could see her jaw locked against it, the tendons standing out in her neck. She was watching the street behind me go dark, building by building, like someone walking down a long hallway, turning off switches one at a time. And she wanted me to see it too. Even with her own bone caught under a pharmacy shutter, she was already reading the larger thing, the way she always read the larger thing. And what she'd read was that the whole world had just shifted under us, and the shutter was the smallest part of it. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest, because it matters for understanding every stupid thing I did that night. The woman with her hand trapped under that gate was my ex-wife. The woman waiting in the car 40 feet away, engine running, headlights painting 2 cones of light across the empty parking spaces, watching all of this happen and gripping the wheel hard enough to whiten her knuckles, was my girlfriend. And the reason all 3 of us were standing at a 24-hour pharmacy on the east side of the city at 9:45 on a Tuesday night was that we were, against every reasonable expectation and against the advice of nearly everyone who knew us, still together, all 3 of us, living in the same apartment, sharing the same refrigerator, the same exhausting peace, the same whiteboard on the kitchen wall with grocery items written above a medication schedule. If you've ever lived inside an arrangement that should not work but somehow does, you already understand how it feels to watch it tested. You spend so much energy holding the thing together that you forget it's fragile. And then something comes along that doesn't care how hard you've worked, and it leans on the whole structure at once. And you find out in about 4 seconds whether what you built can take weight. Stay with me, because what the city did that night leaned on all 3 of us down to the bone. I just want to say, before this goes any further, thank you to everyone who keeps coming back to these stories, and welcome if this is your first time sitting with one. If grounded survival stories like this are the kind of thing you come here for, subscribe, leave a comment, and stay with us a while. It genuinely keeps this channel alive. Now let me get back to that gate and to what came walking out of the dark behind it. My name is Mark Reller. I was 46 that year, a building systems engineer, which is a fancy way of saying I spent 2 decades learning how cities actually run underneath the parts people see. Electrical substations, water pressure, backup generators, fire suppression panels, the boring iron and copper guts of large structures. I knew things most people never think about. I knew that a hospital can run for 3 days on diesel before it starts making hard choices about which floor keeps power. I knew that the hum you hear standing next to a transformer is 60 cycles a second of the entire grid breathing. And I knew that when the lights go out across an entire block at once, it is almost never the lights. Lights fail one fixture at a time. A bulb burns out. A ballast dies. A breaker trips, and you lose a room, maybe a floor. Whole blocks fail when something upstream of them fails. A substation, a feeder line, a control system that decides, for whatever reason, to drop a section of load. And I knew, watching through that shutter, that the way the dark had moved down the street was wrong. Power doesn't fail politely in a line. It fails all at once, or it flickers and fights and browns out before it goes. It does not march. It does not walk down a block. building to building in sequence. The way a man might walk down a corridor, flipping switches. That kind of darkness isn't a failure. That kind of darkness is a decision. So while Dana stood with her fingers pinned under the gate and Priya sat in the car with the engine running and the doors locked, the engineer part of my brain was already quietly screaming that something was operating the grid, switching it off, section by section, in a deliberate pattern. And the only systems in the world that can do that can take a city and turn it off in measured pieces, are the ones designed to isolate sections of a city on purpose, for maintenance, for load shedding when demand spikes in a heat wave, or for containment. Let me back up because you need to understand how 3 adults end up sharing one life. And you need to understand it before the gate, before the man in the parking lot, before any of it, or the rest won't land the way it should. Dana and I were married for 11 years. We were good at a lot of things and bad at the ones that mattered. And we divorced the way most reasonable people do, with lawyers we couldn't really afford and a quiet, tired agreement to be civil about the furniture. There was no villain in it. There rarely is. We'd just become 2 people standing in the same house pointed in different directions. And one day, we admitted it out loud. 2 years later, at a continuing education seminar on seismic retrofitting, of all the unromantic places on Earth, I met Priya. She was a structural engineer, younger than me by 9 years. And she had a way of looking at a problem that made me feel like I'd been doing my job half asleep for most of my career. She asked the questions underneath the questions. We talked through a coffee break, and then through lunch, and then for 3 hours in the parking lot of the convention center. And within a year, she'd moved in. What complicated everything, what turned 2 divorced people and 1 new relationship into the strange 3-cornered thing we became, was Dana's diagnosis. Early onset multiple sclerosis, the relapsing remitting kind. The kind that can put a person in a wheelchair for 3 weeks and then let them walk again like nothing ever happened. And you never know which morning will be which. You wake up and you do an inventory before you even sit up. Hands, feet, the left side, the eyes. Her family was 3 states away and useless in the specific way that families are useless, full of phone call sympathy and no actual help. Her insurance was a maze that reset its own rules every quarter. And she had nobody in the city but me. I'd love to tell you Priya suggested the arrangement out of pure saintliness. But the truth is more human and more practical than that. And I think the practical version is the one that actually held up under pressure. We were already spending half our weekends driving Dana to neurology appointments and infusion centers. We were already keeping her medication schedule on the same whiteboard as our grocery list, because it was easier than 2 whiteboards. One night, after a long day of all of it, Priya just said it out loud while she was drying a pan. "This is insane. She's got a spare bedroom's worth of stuff in your storage unit, and we have a spare bedroom doing nothing. Why are we pretending this isn't already the situation?" And so Dana moved into the 3rd bedroom, and the 3 of us built something that didn't have a name and that I never once tried to explain to my coworkers. It was not romantic between Dana and me anymore. I need you to believe that. Because before the night was over, the question of what we were to each other became something I had to defend with my body and my voice in front of men holding rifles. Dana was family, not ex-family, family. Priya was my partner, the person I planned to grow old beside. The 3 of us had found a strange equilibrium, the kind of thing that looks impossible from outside and just feels like Tuesday from inside. And that pharmacy run was the most ordinary thing in the world for us. Dana's primary MS medication had a 60-day refill window. The insurance authorization expired at midnight. And the only place still carrying the specific infusion supplies that late on a weeknight was the big chain pharmacy out by the highway interchange. We'd done that drive a dozen times. Tuesday night, light traffic, the kind of errand you do half on autopilot. Priya stayed in the car because the only parking near the entrance was a fire lane, and somebody had to be ready to move it if anyone official rolled up. Dana and I went in. Dana wanted to walk that night. She'd had a good week. Her legs were cooperating. And on the good days, she walked everywhere she could because she never knew how many good days were left in any given month. I remember being glad about it. You learn to be grateful for a good week the way you learn to be grateful for anything you can't count on. The pharmacy at that hour was almost empty. Fluorescent light flattening everything to the same pale color. The smell of that particular pharmacy mix, rubbing alcohol and floor cleaner, and the faint sweetness of the candy aisle. A radio playing something soft from a speaker in the ceiling. One other customer somewhere back in the cold and flu section. We went to the consultation counter and the pharmacist pulled up Dana's profile, and I was watching the candy rack and thinking about nothing when I noticed his face change. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, the sleeves of his white coat rolled to the elbow. He was looking at his computer screen with an expression I would come to recognize on 100 faces before the night was over, the specific blankness of a person reading something that doesn't fit into the shape of an ordinary shift. He picked up the store phone, dialed, listened, hung up, dialed again. His hands weren't steady. The second call he just listened to, his lips parting slightly. And then he set the phone down very carefully in its cradle. The way you set down something you're afraid to drop. The system's saying the store's under a hold, he said. To no one in particular, more to himself than to us. I can't dispense controlled meds under a hold. Dana, who had spent 2 years learning to be unnervingly calm about bureaucracy because the alternative was screaming at people who couldn't help her, said, "What kind of hold? Is it an insurance thing? The authorization's good until midnight. I have the reference number right here." She was already reaching into her purse for the folded paper she kept all her numbers on. He turned the screen toward us. I'll never forget it as long as I live. It was a public health advisory, the kind of notice that normally scrolls along the bottom of a screen in fine print that nobody reads. And it said, in plain letters, "Voluntary shelter in place East Districts." And under that, in red, in a line that the pharmacist's posture told me he was not supposed to be showing us, "Do not admit individuals presenting with elevated temperature or disorientation. Refer to Municipal Health Authority." The timestamp on the advisory said it had posted 11 minutes earlier. 11 minutes. Whatever this was, we'd walked into the building in the last quiet 11 minutes of a world that was ending and hadn't known it. That was when the first lights went out. Way down at the far end of the strip mall, through the front windows, the laundromat sign went black. Then the interior of it, then the nail salon, 2 doors up, then the phone repair place. We could see it happen in sequence, the dark sliding toward us along the row of storefronts. And the pharmacist saw it too. The radio in the ceiling cut to silence mid-song. The compressor of a cooler somewhere behind the counter wound down. And the pharmacist did the thing that I think saved us and doomed us in equal measure. The thing a careful man does when his careful systems start telling him to be afraid. He walked to the front of the store, past us, and he started bringing the security gate down. "Sir," I said, "my wife needs her medication. The authorization expires tonight." "I'm sorry," he said, and he wasn't even looking at me. He was looking past me, through the front glass, out into the parking lot, where under the orange wash of the sodium lights that still worked, a single figure was walking. Not running, walking, but walking wrong. His whole body was canted forward, leaning into a wind that wasn't there. His arms moving in a way that didn't match his stride, his head down. He was crossing the lot diagonally, against the painted lines, toward the lit storefront, the way a moth crosses a room toward a lamp. The pharmacist hit the switch, and the gate started down in a controlled rattle. Dana had stepped forward in that moment to grab her purse off the counter, and she'd reached under the descending gate to do it. And the timing was just bad. The kind of bad that has nothing to do with anyone's fault. The gate caught her hand. 3 fingers, the index, middle, and ring pinned at the second knuckle between the rubber-edged steel and the lip of the counter base. The pharmacist hit the reverse switch the instant he realized. But the gate had a safety lag. A deliberate 2-second pause built into the motor controller before it would change direction. A feature designed for some entirely different and reasonable purpose. And in those 2 seconds, Dana's face went the color of paper. She made one small sound through her teeth, just a hiss of breath. And then she said the thing I told you at the start. She told me the lights were going out across the block. She was already past her own crushed hand. She was already watching the man in the parking lot. She was already 3 moves ahead of me, the way she'd been 3 moves ahead of me for 15 years. The gate lifted 4 inches, and Dana pulled her hand free and cradled it against her chest, against her sternum, the fingers already darkening. And the pharmacist froze with his palm flat on the switch, because now the gate was stopped 4 inches off the floor, and the man in the parking lot had crossed the last of the distance and reached the glass. He pressed both palms flat against the front window, and I got my first clear look at his face. And I understood that the advisory's careful words, elevated temperature disorientation, were a polite government way of describing something that polite government language was never going to be adequate for, not in 100 years of advisories. His eyes were the wrong color. Not glowing, nothing supernatural, nothing out of a movie. The whites of both eyes were flooded dark red, the way an eye looks the day after a hard blow, except both of them, completely, edge to edge, so the dark irises sat in a field of blood. And there was a stillness to his face that I've only ever otherwise seen on people who are no longer entirely present in their own bodies. He wasn't snarling. He wasn't making any expression at all. His jaw was working slowly, a steady chewing motion on nothing. And he just looked through the glass at the 3 of us with those flooded eyes. His breath fogging the window in slow, irregular pulses. And the fog didn't clear the way a normal person's breath clears, because his breathing was too slow and too even and too deep. "Don't move," the pharmacist whispered. He'd backed away from the switch. His hand was over his mouth. Behind me, faintly, through the glass and the dead night, I heard a car horn. 2 short taps, then 1 long one. Priya, our signal, the one we'd worked out for crowds and parking lots and the times you get separated. The one that meant come now. Something's wrong. Drop everything. I turned and looked through the part of the window that the man's body didn't block, and I could see our car out in the lot, headlights still burning, and Priya behind the wheel, and a second figure crossing the painted asphalt toward the car at that same forward-leaning walk. I made the first of the night's bad decisions in about half a second, and I made it for love, which is how most of the night's bad decisions got made. I told Dana to get behind the counter with the pharmacist, and then I told the pharmacist to lift the gate the rest of the way, because my girlfriend was alone in a car with one of those things walking toward her. And I was not going to stand inside a locked box and watch it happen through glass. The pharmacist refused, and I understood his logic even as I hated it standing there. He said fast, low, his eyes flicking between me and the man at the glass, that the moment that gate came up, The man at the window would be inside. And there were 2 women here he could keep safe if I'd just hold still for 30 seconds and think. He was a stranger making a cold, defensible calculation about 3 people he'd met 4 minutes earlier. He was probably right. I've thought about him many times since, that careful man with his reading glasses on his forehead, because I never did learn his name in the pharmacy. And I've wondered whether being right about that gate kept him alive or got him killed. Dana settled it. She came around the end of the counter, holding her ruined hand against her sternum, moving carefully but moving. And she looked the pharmacist dead in the eyes, and she said, "There's a fire exit in the back. Every stockroom in the country has one, by code. We're going out the back, all 3 of us. And you're going to come with us or lock it behind us. Your choice. But my husband's girlfriend is alone in that car, and we are not leaving without her. She called me her husband. She did it on purpose. I knew her well enough to know she did it on purpose, to make the pharmacist understand in one word that we were a unit, a single thing, not a bystander and a customer, but a family that moved together. And she called Priya my girlfriend in the same breath, plainly, without flinching. And the pharmacist's face did a brief, complicated thing, the math of it visibly not adding up. And then he simply nodded, because the world was ending outside his window. And our domestic arrangement was, by a wide margin, the least strange thing happening to him that night. The back of the pharmacy was a different world from the bright, clean front. A maze of tall steel shelving stacked with cardboard cases, rolling carts half-loaded, a walk-in cooler humming on its own small backup power. The air cooler back here and thick with the smell of cardboard and refrigerant. The emergency lights had come on little twin bulb fixtures high on the walls, throwing harsh pools of white that left deep shadows between the shelving rows. The fire exit was exactly where Donna had said it would be. A steel door with a horizontal crash bar and an illuminated exit sign glowing green above it. And next to the door, on the wall, was a small gray box, and the sight of it made my stomach drop through the floor. It was a magnetic lock controller, the kind that ties a door into a building's life safety system. And its little status light, which should have been green, which is green in every properly functioning building in the world, was amber. I stopped and stared at it for half a second longer than I should have. Amber on that controller meant the building's fire panel had been put into a manual override. Someone, somewhere, had reached into this building's brain and told its safety systems to stop behaving the way they were designed to behave. And the thing about manual override on a life safety panel is that it can do the opposite of what the system was built for. Doors that are supposed to fail open in an emergency so people can escape, so firefighters can get in, can be made to fail locked. I hit the crash bar anyway, hard with the heel of my hand. And the door gave and swung outward, and cold night air came pouring in. And for one full second, I let myself feel relief. And then I heard the sound that the rest of the night would be built around. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. A low electronic tone, 3 rising notes, repeating. The kind of tone that public address systems play before an announcement, the test pattern sound. The sound that means a recorded voice is coming. It was issuing from speakers I couldn't see, mounted somewhere high on the strip mall's exterior, part of some municipal emergency system I had never once heard tested in 20 years of living in that city. And after the 3rd repetition of the tone, a voice. Calm, recorded. A woman's voice. The smooth, neutral cadence of an automated system that has been recorded in a quiet studio by someone who is paid by the hour. Attention. This is a public safety message. The area you are in has been designated a containment zone. For your safety, remain indoors. Emergency services have been suspended in this district. Do not attempt to travel west. Repeat. do not attempt to travel west. West. West was the only way out of that part of the city, and I knew it the way I knew my own hands. West was the river. West was the bridges and downtown and the highway. West was home, our apartment, the third bedroom, the whiteboard. And a recorded voice that knew enough about us to be playing through speakers I hadn't even known existed was telling the entire district not to go there. The pharmacist had followed us to the back door, and now he stopped. And I watched his face do the math that everyone in that district would do that night in some version. The voice said, "Stay indoors." The voice said, "Don't go west." But the voice also said emergency services have been suspended, which meant nobody was coming, which meant the only people who were going to get any of us home were ourselves. He looked at the amber light on the lock controller, and then he looked at me, and he said the first thing that made me actually trust him. "That announcement's automated," he said. "Pre-recorded, which means somebody set it up in advance. They wrote it, they recorded it, they loaded it into the system, and they had it sitting there ready. And tonight, somebody pushed the button. They knew this could happen." He was right. And the rightness of it was colder than anything outside the window. The man at the glass was a horror, but he was a simple horror. An animal drawn to light. A city that had a containment protocol loaded and waiting with speakers and locks and grid controls, all wired to flip on a single command that was a different kind of horror entirely. Because it meant that somewhere, in some meeting I would never be shown, people in good clothes had sat around a table and decided that there were parts of the city worth sealing off and worth writing down in advance as an acceptable loss. I stepped out the back door into the loading alley, and that's where the night truly began. The alley ran behind the entire strip mall. A long concrete trough, maybe 12 feet wide, walled by the backs of the businesses on one side and a low retaining wall on the other, lined with dumpsters and stacked pallets and runs of electrical conduit bolted to the brick. The pharmacy's loading bay opened onto it, and so did the laundromats and the salons and half a dozen others. And at the far end, the alley turned a corner and connected to the side street where I'd watched Priya park. I came out fast and low, with Dana right behind me cradling her hand, and the pharmacist behind her. And I turned left toward the corner, and I had maybe 20 feet of visibility because the alley's lights were among the things that had gone dark. I have to describe the quality of that darkness because it became the first tool I used and the first thing that nearly got us killed. With the streetlights and the building lights and the alley fixtures all dead, the only illumination came from the sky itself as the orange sodium glow reflecting off the low cloud cover from the parts of the city far off to the west that still had power. It was a dirty, sourceless light. The color of old street lamps bounced off clouds. And it lets you see shapes, but not faces, mass but not detail, the difference between a man and a dumpster, but not the difference between a living man and a dead one. Everything in the alley was rendered in that orange murk, edges soft, depth uncertain. And in that light, I could see, swinging around the corner at the far end where the alley met the side street, the twin cones of our car's headlights sweeping across the brick as Priya turned. She'd moved the car. She was driving it down the side street toward the alley, toward us, which was either brilliant or suicidal depending entirely on what was in front of her. What was in front of her, I learned as the headlights swung fully across the alley mouth, was 4 of them. 4 of the canted, forward-leaning walkers, strung loosely across the side street. And the moment the high beam swept over them, all 4 heads came around at once, turning toward the light with that same slow, chewing patience. And in the wash of the headlights, I saw the thing that rearranged my entire understanding of what we were up against. They didn't flinch from the light. They oriented to it. They turned toward the brightest thing in their world, and they began to move. And they moved faster when they had a target. The canted shuffle accelerating into something with purpose. The light wasn't a deterrent. It wasn't a defense. It was a beacon. It was a dinner bell. Ringing across the dark, Priya killed the headlights. She did it instantly, before I could even draw breath to shout. And the street dropped back into orange murk. And the four shapes lost their reference point and slowed, drifting, their heads swinging back and forth as they hunted for the thing that had been there a second ago. My girlfriend, who in her entire life had never faced anything more dangerous than a contractor lying to her about a load-bearing wall, had figured out the single most important rule of the night in under 3 seconds, faster than I did, faster than the pharmacist did, faster than anyone I would meet that night except one. They follow light, they follow motion, they follow sound. And the way you survive them is to become as dark and as still and as silent as the dead grid around you. The car was a low black shape now, idling almost inaudibly with its lights off, 20 feet back from the alley mouth. And between it and us, 4 infected drifted in the side street, slow and patient and searching. I pressed myself flat against the cold brick of the alley wall and pulled Dana in beside me. And the pharmacist crowded in on her other side, and the 3 of us and the car, with Priya inside it, waited in the dark while those things wandered and turned and wandered again, looking for a light that had gone out. That was the situation, maybe 16 minutes after the laundromat sign went black. My ex-wife had 3 crushed fingers and a disease that could put her on the ground without an hour's warning. My girlfriend was trapped in a car she couldn't drive without switching on the one thing guaranteed to bring the infected down on her. A stranger who understood the building systems better than I'd expected was breathing hard and shallow against the brick beside me. And somewhere above all of us, a calm, recorded woman's voice was telling the entire district to stay where it was and die quietly. Because the part of the city worth saving was west, on the other side of a river, behind bridges that I would have bet my life were already closing. I had to get all of us to the car. Then I had to get the car west, through a containment zone that the city itself had decided to write off. And I had to do it without light, because light was death, in a city that had just deliberately turned off all of its own. The first thing I did was the right thing, and it nearly cost us everything, which is a sentence that describes most of that night. I needed to reach the car, and the 4 infected were between me and it, drifting in the murk of the side street. I could see Priya's silhouette behind the wheel, motionless, doing exactly what she should be doing. Staying dark, staying still, not even shifting her weight. The smart move, the patient move, the move I'd have given anyone else, was to wait. Wait for the infected to drift far enough down the street that I could slip across the open ground to the car. But Dana's hand was bleeding more than I'd realized in the dark. I could feel it. A slow warmth down her wrist where she leaned against me, and the pharmacist had started to make a low sound in the back of his throat. A thin, continuous note that I recognized as the front edge of panic. The sound a person makes right before they do something loud. And I made the call to move now instead of waiting. I put my mouth close to Dana's ear and told her to stay flat against the wall and not move no matter what she saw, and to keep her hand pressed tight to slow the bleeding. And she nodded once against my shoulder. And then I went, low along the base of the alley wall toward the mouth, toward the car, in a crouching shuffle of my own, one hand trailing on the cold brick to keep my orientation, putting each foot down, toe first, the way you walk when you don't want the floor to know you're there. The infected were maybe 40 feet up the street to my right. The car was 20 feet to my left, across the open mouth of the alley. The open part was the problem, 5 steps with no cover at all, fully exposed in the orange half-light, where any motion might register to whatever passed for their senses. I made it 3 steps before one of them turned. It wasn't because of me. I'd been careful, slow, silent. It turned because a flattened cardboard box, caught by a gust of wind funneling down the side street, chose that exact moment to skid across the asphalt with a dry scraping rasp. And all 4 heads snapped around toward the sound at once. And in that motion, I learned the rule beneath the rule. Not just light, not just motion that they could see, but sound. Any sound, in a district that the dead grid had rendered so silent that a sliding cardboard box was an event, a thing worth turning your whole body toward. I froze mid-stride, 1 foot off the ground, my weight balanced on the other, and I held it. My thigh started to burn. The 4 infected drifted toward the cardboard, away from me, their canted shapes converging on the small, dry sound. And I let my raised foot down, a half inch at a time, until the sole touched concrete in silence. And then I covered the last of the open ground and reached the car. I came up against the passenger side, and I did not yank the door open, because the interior dome light would come on. And the dome light in that orange dark would be a flare visible for 100 yards in every direction, a beacon as good as the headlights. Priya had already thought of it. When I reached the window, lo, she pointed urgently up at the headliner, and I understood. She'd reached up and switched the dome light to the off position, the little manual override most people never touch in their entire lives. The door would open dark. I worked the handle slowly and eased the door open, and folded myself down into the passenger seat, and drew it shut to the first detente, the first soft click, not the full latch, just enough to hold. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I could hear her breathing, fast and controlled, and I could smell the cold sweat of fear on both of us. And outside the car, the 4 infected were still pawing at the cardboard box. "Donna's hurt," I whispered finally. "Her hand. The gate caught it, and there's a man from the pharmacy with her. They're against the wall in the alley." "I know. I saw it through the window before the lights died." Her voice was steady, but her hands on the wheel were not, the knuckles white, the smallest tremor in them. "Mark, the bridges. While you were inside, I had the radio on. Low. It's bad. They're closing the bridges. They said the Vance Street Bridge is already up, fully raised, and they're staging units at the Halloran Bridge. The river crossings. They're sealing the east side off from downtown. They keep saying containment." There it was, confirmed in the worst possible way and from the worst possible source. The calm voice of a radio announcer reading off the same plan the recorded voice had hinted at. The automated message told us not to go west, because west was where the bridges were, and the bridges were the seam the city was closing. And we were on the wrong side of a line that was being drawn in real time. And the line was a river. And rivers only have so many crossings. I knew that river. I'd spent 8 months a decade earlier working on the pump stations along it. I knew there were 5 vehicle crossings in the whole metro area. And I knew the difference between them in a way most people never would have reason to. 2 were drawbridges that could be physically raised vents, and 1 further south downtown. The other 3 were fixed spans that couldn't be lifted at all, which meant the only way to close a fixed span was to physically block it, with vehicles or barricades or men. And that took time and people, where raising a drawbridge took one operator and 90 seconds. If Vance was already up, that left the Halloran, where the radio said they were merely staging, and the two fixed southern spans that they'd have to barricade by hand. We had a window. It was closing, but it existed, and I could see its shape. Halloran's about 9 miles west of us, I said. The south fixed spans are closer to 12. Vance is already gone. We have maybe an hour before everything's sealed. Probably less, if the staging at Halloran is far enough along. We can't drive 9 miles with the lights off, Priya said, and she was exactly right. And that single sentence was the whole problem of the night distilled. Driving in the dark with the headlights off, through streets we now had to assume were full of stalled and abandoned cars and infected that homed in on light and sound and movement, was nearly impossible. You'd crawl, you'd hit something within a block. But driving with the lights on was simple suicide. The car, the thing that was supposed to save us, the thing Dana could not survive without because she could not walk 9 miles and might not be able to walk at all by morning. The car was a lit, loud, fast-moving beacon in a district where light and sound and speed were the three things that got you killed. I sat there in the passenger seat, looking back through the rear window at the dark shape against the alley wall that was Dana and the pharmacist, and at the 4 infected still clustered around the cardboard, and I did the only thing I have ever really known how to do, the thing they paid me for, the thing that had organized my entire adult mind. I started thinking about systems. The car had a system. Headlights, yes, but also parking lights, fog lights, the glow of the instrument cluster, the dome light we'd already killed, and the brake lights that flared red every single time you touched the pedal. Every one of those was a beacon. But the car also had a property that people forget about because they never need it. It could roll without the engine running at all. In neutral, downhill, silent, dark. And this entire side of the city sloped down toward the river. The land itself tilted west, toward the flats, toward the crossings. The whole East District was built on the long, shallow grade that ran down to the floodplain. Gravity pointed the exact direction we needed to go. We roll it, I said. Engine off, lights off, in neutral. The grade runs downhill all the way to the river flats. I worked the flood system out there. I know the terrain. We steer, we let gravity carry it. We keep it slow and silent. We only start the engine if we absolutely have to. Priya turned her head and looked at me in the dark, and I could just make out her eyes. And the brake lights, she said, not a question. She'd already found the flaw in my plan before I'd finished saying it, which is exactly why I loved her, and exactly why I trusted her with the wheel. Every time I touched the brakes to control a roll downhill, the rear lights flare. In this dark, that's a strobe. It's a signal saying, here, 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 behind us, the whole way down the hill. It'll pull every infected on the route into our wake. She was right, so before we did anything else, before I even went back for Dana and the pharmacist, while they waited against the wall, I got out of the car and eased the trunk open by feel in the dark, holding the lid so it wouldn't pop up and trigger the trunk light, finding the fuse box exactly where I knew it would be, because I'm the kind of man who reads the owner's manual the week he buys a car. There was a fuse diagram printed on the underside of the panel cover, and I'd memorized the layout of cars like this years ago. I pulled the fuse for the rear running lights. Then I pulled the fuse for the brake circuit separately. The brakes themselves would still work. They were hydraulic, mechanical. The pedal pushed fluid and the calipers clamped. Nothing electrical about the actual stopping. They just wouldn't announce themselves anymore. No red flare. The car could brake in total darkness. It cost us 4 minutes, crouched at the back of the car in the orange murk. And it was the smartest 4 minutes I spent that entire night. Then I went back for Dana and the pharmacist. This is where I have to tell you about the pharmacist properly, because his name finally came up in that alley. And because of what he chose to do. While I'd been at the car, he'd been talking quietly with Dana against the wall. And when I crouched back down beside them in the dark, he told me his name was Errol. He told me he'd been a pharmacist for 26 years. And he told me he had a daughter at the university west of the river, and that he was not coming with us in the car. 5 people in that car, he said, his voice low and fast and surprisingly level now. The panic note gone, replaced by something that had decided. Plus her bad hand. Plus the 2 of you trying to steer in the dark with a hurt woman in the back. You don't have the room, and you don't have the luck for 5. Don't argue. I've already done the math standing here. He pressed something into my palm. Cold, jagged. A key ring. The pharmacy's got a panel van out back for deliveries. It's parked at the end of the loading bay, the white one. Bigger, slower, but it's a van. You sit up high in a van. You can see over the cars in the road, but you can't do in that sedan. I'm taking the van, and I'm going to draw them. You take the car, and you go quiet downhill, behind me. When I figure you're far enough ahead, I'll put the van's lights on and lean on the horn and pull everything in this district off your route and onto mine. He was offering to be the beacon. He was offering to be the light, the noise, the moving thing that the infected followed, so that we could be the dark. I told him no, reflexively, immediately, the way you do. I told him we'd all fit somehow. We'd make it work. Nobody needed to be bait. And Errol, who I had now known for 31 minutes, gave me a look that I think a lot of fathers would recognize. A patient, finished look. And he said, "My daughter is on the other side of that river, and I'm getting across it tonight, one way or another, with you or without you. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for me. You just get to benefit from it. Now take the keys. Take the alley to the right. At the second turn it dumps onto Crescent Avenue, and Crescent runs downhill to the flats. I've done deliveries on these streets for years. Trust the grade. It'll carry you most of the way down." He knew the streets the way I knew the systems under them. He'd driven them at 3 in the morning with prescriptions for shut-ins for 2 decades. If you'd been crouched in that alley with us, with a stranger pressing his keys into your hand and offering to draw the dead away while you rolled silent down the hill, would you have taken the keys? Or would you have insisted he come with you and tried to make 5 fit? I still don't know to this day whether I let a man do something brave or something that killed him. Tell me what you would have done. I genuinely want to know, because I've never settled it. I took the keys. I took them because Dana's hand was bleeding, because Priya was alone in the car, because Errol had a plan and conviction, and I had neither a better plan nor the standing to refuse a man his own choice. We got Dana to the car, into the back seat, and I wrapped her crushed hand in a clean blue shop towel I found in the trunk and showed her how to hold it elevated against her shoulder to slow the bleeding. And she looked at the dark towel and said dryly, "Even then, even there, I've had worse Tuesdays." It was a lie, and a kind one. And the fact that she could make it in that moment told me she was holding together better than her hand was. Priya took the wheel because she had the steadiest hands of any of us under pressure, and because steering a dead rolling 2-ton car downhill in the dark by feel and instinct and sky glow is a structural problem, a problem of mass and momentum and reading a slope, and structures were her entire life. I took the passenger seat to watch the road and call the turns. Dana sat behind me with her hand against her shoulder. We released the parking brake, and Priya eased her foot off the brake pedal. And the car began to move. It is hard to put into words how loud silence is when your survival depends on it. The car rolled with nothing but the sound of the tires turning over grit, a low, continuous hiss, and the small, periodic ticks of the suspension settling over the uneven pavement. And every one of those tiny sounds felt to me like a shout in a library. The grade was gentle at first, walking pace, the car drifting forward like a boat off a dock, and Priya steered it out of the side street, keeping clear of the 4 infected who were still nosing at the cardboard. And none of them turned. We coasted onto the long, shallow downhill of Crescent Avenue. And somewhere far ahead and below in the dark was the river, 9 miles down the slope, behind bridges that were closing one at a time. And then, 2 blocks behind us, an engine roared to life, and a pair of headlights blazed on, high and bright, the headlights of a van mounted higher than a car's, and a horn began to blare in a long, unbroken blast. And the orange murk of the street back there lit up with the shapes of them more than I had imagined. Far more. Dozens of canted figures all turning at once toward the noise and the light, all beginning to move toward Errol's van, away from us, away from Crescent, away from the river road. He'd been right. We could never have driven through that many. They came out of doorways and side streets and from between parked cars, drawn to him the way iron filings snap to a magnet. And his taillights began to shrink to the north as he led them away. And the horn faded. And then we couldn't see the van anymore. Only the diminishing wash of its lights on the buildings, and then not even that. And we rolled on down the hill in the dark and the silence, 3 crushed fingers, 3 living people, and a stranger's gift of an empty road in front of us. For about a mile, the plan worked perfectly. And that is exactly how long it took for me to learn that the infected were not that night the real problem. The trouble announced itself, the way trouble did all night, as a light where no light should have been. We were rolling down Crescent at a steady 15 miles an hour, the car picking up a little speed on a steeper section, the dark storefronts and the dead traffic signals sliding past on either side. And Priya was threading the car between a stalled delivery truck slewed across one lane and a row of cars parked at the curb, with maybe 18 inches of clearance on each side, doing it entirely by feel and sky glow, and the kind of spatial instinct you can't teach. The car's tires were the only sound. And then I saw it, ahead and below us, where Crescent met the larger avenue that ran along the top of the river flats. A hard white light, stationary, blocking the intersection. Not the warm amber of a sodium streetlight, not the sweeping yellow of moving headlights. A fixed, cold, white floodlight. The harsh blue-white of a portable lighting mast, the kind you see at construction sites and roadwork and checkpoints. "Stop," I breathed, and Priya was already off the gas and onto the now dark brakes, easing the rolling car to a silent halt behind the bulk of a stalled city bus that gave us cover from the intersection below. I got out low, eased the door to its first detente behind me, and crept along the flank of the bus to its front corner. And I looked. It was a checkpoint, a real one, manned. There were 2 vehicles parked nose to nose across the avenue, blocking it completely, and the floodlight on its telescoping mast throwing a cone of white over the whole intersection, and figures moving around it in a way that was nothing at all like the infected, upright, controlled, purposeful, and armed. But the vehicles weren't police cruisers, and they weren't military trucks. They were a civilian pickup and a civilian panel van. And the figures around them were in ordinary clothes jackets, ball caps carrying rifles and shotguns, and they had strung something low across the road between the vehicles, a chain or a cable. As I watched, a sedan came down the avenue from the east with its headlights blazing. Somebody else trying to reach the river, and it slowed at the floodlight. And one of the armed figures stepped forward into the cone of light and raised a flat hand. There was a conversation I couldn't hear, just the shapes of it. The figure leaning to the driver's window. And then the figure stepped back and waved the sedan through a gap between the two parked vehicles, and the sedan drove on west, down toward the river, and was gone. For a moment I felt the first real hope of the entire night flood through me, warm and stupid. People, order, someone running a checkpoint, letting cars through, controlling the chaos. Away west. I almost stood up out of my crouch and walked down toward the light. And then a second car came down the avenue and slowed at the floodlight. And this conversation was longer and louder. Loud enough that fragments of it carried up the slope to where I crouched against the bus, and the tone of it was all wrong. Raised and sharp. And then one of the armed figures pulled the driver's door open and dragged a man out into the white light by his arm. And another figure climbed into the car and drove it himself through the gap and parked it on the far side, in a row, and now that I was looking, I could see the row. 8 or 9 cars lined up on the far side of the checkpoint, parked, empty. And the man they'd pulled out was made to stand against the side of the panel van, with his hands laced behind his head, while 2 of them went through his pockets and then through his trunk, pulling things out, sorting them on the ground. It wasn't a rescue. It was a toll. They were letting people through if those people had something worth taking. And the thing they wanted most was the cars themselves, plus whatever a fleeing family had thrown in the trunk at the last desperate minute: water, fuel, food, medicine. They'd set up on the choke point to the river because they understood, exactly as I understood, that every single person on the east side was being funneled toward the same handful of crossings, downhill, by the same grade and the same closing bridges, which meant everyone would eventually have to pass through this intersection. And a man with a rifle sitting on a choke point during a collapse is a man who has just become very rich and knows it. I went back to the car and slid in and told Priya and Dana what I'd seen. Low and fast, the whole shape of it. And Dana, from the back seat, holding her wrapped hand against her shoulder, asked the question that cut straight to the center of the thing, the question I should have asked myself, but hadn't. "They've got their headlights on," she said. "The floodlights on. They're talking, shouting, running engines. How are they not swarmed? With everything we've seen tonight. That intersection should be a magnet." It was the right question, the structural question, the engineer's question, and the answer to it rearranged the entire map in my head. The checkpoint wasn't swarmed because the checkpoint had already cleared its own ground. Those cars parked on the far side, the open space around the mast, and the dark shapes I now realized I'd seen, crumpled in the gutter near the floodlight they'd been set up here, long enough to kill or drive off every infected in their immediate zone. And now they sat in a pool of hard white light in a cleared space, like a campfire in a forest at night. And everything dangerous had either been put down or had drifted back to the edges of the light. But that also meant the light and the noise of the checkpoint was a constant magnet, pulling every infected for blocks around down the hill toward the glow. And I could hear it now that I was listening for it under the other sounds, the occasional flat crack of a rifle from down there, spaced out, unhurried, methodical. Not panic fire, maintenance fire. They were keeping a perimeter clear, one careful shot at a time, which meant they were organized and dug in and not going anywhere, and sitting squarely across the only road down to the river. We had 3 choices, and I laid them out in my own head and then out loud. We could go through the checkpoint and pay whatever they demanded. And for us, what they would demand was the car. And we could not lose the car. Dana could not walk 9 miles. Dana might not be able to walk at all by morning. The car was the one non-negotiable. Or we could turn around and climb back up into the dark district we'd just escaped, which meant starting the engine to go uphill against the grade, announcing ourselves with noise and exhaust, and driving back into exactly the territory that Errol had drawn the entire swarm into. Suicide of a slower kind. Or we could find another way down to the river, a route that didn't pass through the choke point, on some side road, in the dark, knowing full well that the reason this was the choke point in the first place was that the terrain funneled everything here, and that a way around it might simply not exist. I am an engineer. When I don't know the terrain, I find someone who does. Or I find the part of the terrain that other people forget exists. And I'd been handed, an hour earlier, a man who'd driven these streets for 20 years, and is thinking trust the grade. Think about the slope. Think about how a vehicle gets from the high east side down to the flats had lodged in my head. And it knocked something loose. Because there is more than one way down to a river, especially a river with a flood control system. And I had spent 8 months of my life inside that system. The pump stations, the Levee Road. I'd worked on the river's stormwater pump stations a decade earlier, the intake retrofit on a couple of them. The river had a whole flood control infrastructure, a chain of pump stations that, during heavy rain, pumped runoff from the low east flats up and over the levee and into the river, so the flats didn't drown every time it stormed. And those stations were connected, all of them, by a service road, a maintenance road that ran along the base of the levee, below the level of the surface streets, behind the earthen wall, out of sight, that the public never used, and that most people in the city didn't know existed at all. It ran parallel to the river for miles, below grade, and it connected up to the surface streets at each pump station through gated access ramps. And this was the part that made my pulse jump in my throat. One of those pump stations sat right at the foot of the Halloran Bridge, because the bridge approach and the flood control system shared the same low ground and the same infrastructure corridor. If I could get the car down onto the levee service road, I could run it along the base of the levee, below the streets, hidden, out of sight and out of the funnel, all the way west to the foot of the Halloran, and come up at the bridge approach, bypassing every street-level choke point between here and the crossing. The catch there's always a catch. The whole night was nothing but catches stacked on catches was that the access ramps were gated, sliding steel gates, and the gates were on the municipal flood control system, and I had no key. But I knew how those gates worked, intimately, because I'd watched them being commissioned. They were on the same family of life safety logic as the pharmacy's doors. And in a power failure, they were designed to fail open, to leave the maintenance route clear during exactly the kind of emergency where the grid might be down and the flood system might be desperately needed. The grid was down. The gates should be open, or at least unpowered and forcible. Should be. But everything that night that should have done one thing had done the other. The pharmacy's locks should have failed open and had failed locked, because someone had reached in and put the building into manual override. And the same authority that had loaded a containment announcement years in advance and was now raising bridges might very well have thought to lock down the flood control access too. It was a gamble. But it was a gamble in the dark, below the streets, away from the men with rifles. And it satisfied every rule we'd learned the hard way that night. Stay low, stay dark, stay quiet. The nearest access ramp, the one I could picture, was 4 blocks back up the hill and 1 block south, behind a self-storage facility, down a road I'd driven exactly once, in daylight, in a city truck 10 years before. I was about to navigate to it from a decade-old memory, in the dark, rolling a dead car backward up a grade, with my ex-wife bleeding in the back seat and my girlfriend's hands shaking on the wheel. We backed the car. Priya did it, in reverse, in neutral, letting it roll back up the slight grade we had just descended, using the slope to do the work, steering by the rear window and the side mirrors in near total darkness until we found a cross street wide enough to turn the car around without engine. It was the most delicate piece of driving I have ever witnessed in my life. And she did it without a word, jaw set, eyes flicking between the mirrors, easing the dark brakes, feathering the wheel. And then we worked our way south and east, away from the checkpoint's white glow, into a darker and quieter and somehow colder pocket of the district, hunting for the storage facility and the ramp behind it. And it was in that darker pocket, away from the checkpoint and away from the swarm Errol had pulled north, that I learned the thing that broke the whole night open and turned it from a survival story into a different kind of story altogether. We found the storage facility a long, low block of orange roll-up doors behind a chain-link fence. We found the road that ran behind it. And we found the access ramp, a downward-sloping concrete chute that disappeared below street level toward the Levee road, exactly where my decade-old memory had placed it. And at the top of the ramp, the sliding steel gate was open, failed open, just as the design intended. The one system all night that had behaved precisely the way it was supposed to. I almost laughed with relief. But the ramp wasn't empty. There was a vehicle parked at the bottom of it, nose in toward the inner gate that led onto the Levee road, sitting dark with its lights off. And, as our dead car coasted to a stop at the top of the ramp, that vehicle's lights came on all at once. Full high beams aimed straight up the ramp into our windshield, blinding us. And a voice called out, a living, human, frightened, hard-edged voice. "Stop the car and show me your hands, or I shoot the driver first." Priya's hands came off the wheel and straight up into the air, fast. Dana in the back went absolutely still, and I sat in the passenger seat, blinded by the glare, my heart slamming. And I did the only thing I could think of that might keep us breathing, which was to talk, fast and plain, and full of the specific kind of detail that a person can't fake. "We're not infected," I called out through the windshield. "3 of us. One's hurt her hand, that's all. A door caught it. She's not sick. We're trying to reach the Levee road. I worked on the flood system. I know it connects west to the Halloran. We don't want any trouble. We'll back this car out right now if you need the ramp. Just tell us what you want." There was a silence. The high beams held us pinned. And then the voice, closer now, moving up the ramp toward us, said something that made no sense, and then, a half second later, made too much sense. "You worked on the flood system." A pause. "Did you work on Station 6? Station 6. The pump station at the foot of the Halloran Bridge. The one I had just been navigating us toward through the dark. The specific station whose intake I had retrofitted 10 years before. "Yes," I said, slowly, the word coming out careful. 10 years ago, the intake retrofit, the new screens and the actuator." A longer silence. Then the high beams dropped abruptly to parking lights, and a figure came up the ramp into the faint sky glow and the spill of our own dead car's reflectors. And it was a woman, 50 or so, gray hair pulled back tight, in a municipal flood-controlled jacket with reflective stripes that caught what little light there was. She had a pistol held low and ready, not pointed at us now, but not put away either, and a radio clipped to her shoulder, and an expression on her face that was equal parts raw terror and rapid calculation. She had the specific weathered competence I recognized in my own bones, The look of someone who has spent an entire career in the unglamorous concrete and steel guts of a city. The look of someone who knows where the valves are. "My name's Renata Voss," she said. "I run the West River Flood District. 22 years. Her eyes moved over the car. Priya's raised hands. Dana's wrapped hand held against her shoulder in the back, me. "And I have got a very large problem at Station 6. And you just told me you're the only person I've met all night who knows how its intake works." She let the pistol drop fully to her side. "Put your hands down. I'm not going to shoot you. But listen to me carefully, because you are not getting to the Halloran the way you think you are. And if you want to live, you are going to want to hear why before you do anything else." And that was the midpoint of the night. That was the moment the whole thing turned over in the dark and showed me its underside. The moment everything I thought I understood about what was happening rearranged itself into a worse and truer shape. Because what Renata Voss told me, standing at the top of that ramp with the dead city above us and the hidden Levee road below us, was that the containment of the east side was not being enforced by raising the bridges. The bridges were a feint, a piece of theater designed to make a panicked population funnel toward the choke points where they could be managed, counted, and ultimately abandoned. The actual containment plan, the one loaded into the city's emergency systems years ago and triggered tonight along with the recorded voice and the grid sequencing, was the river itself. And the river's level its behavior, where it went and didn't go, was controlled by the flood pump stations, by Station 6 and its siblings, by the exact infrastructure I happen to know how to operate. They were going to flood the East Flats. The whole low-lying Eastern District, the one we were standing in, the one full of infected and survivors, an arrow drawing a swarm somewhere to the north, sat below the level of the river behind its levee. The flood control system existed, ordinarily, to keep river water out and to pump rainwater up and over the wall. But the system could be run in reverse. Open the right gates, reverse the right pumps, hold the right sluices open, and you could invite the river into the flats, fill the basin, and turn the entire Eastern District into a bowl filling with cold, dark water. Drown the zone. Drown what was in it, all of it, the sick and the well together. A containment method that required no soldiers, no walls, no firing squads, no awful footage, just a decision made in a quiet room and a set of commands sent down a wire to stations that had been built decades earlier by people who imagined only storms. The city had constructed, without ever quite saying so, the capacity to drown its own poorest district, and had filed that capacity in a binder labeled flood control. And nobody had ever once imagined that the binder would be opened and used as a weapon against the people who lived inside it. "They started the prep about 2 hours ago," Renata said, and her voice was steady, but I could hear what it was costing her to keep it steady. Remote commands going out to the stations, gate sequences, pump reversals. I watched them come through on the district control system before the comms went down for good. Station 6 is the master station for the entire Halloran Basin. It sets the level for this whole low section. If 6 runs its full sequence to completion, this district fills in about 90 minutes, and there is no high ground east of the levee that the water won't reach. None. I've run the models. The whole flats go under. She stopped, and her jaw worked, and her voice cracked for the first time. I tried to lock 6 out from my end, from the district office. I couldn't. The override authority's been pulled up to the central level. Somebody downtown is running it directly. The only way to stop 6 now is to be physically standing at the station and break the sequence by hand at the local panel. And I can't get to 6, because 6 is at the foot of the Halloran, and the Halloran approach is exactly where those checkpoint people came down from. And they fired on me, when I tried to get past them. I've been sitting in this ramp for 40 minutes, trying to think of another way in. So now I understood the full and terrible shape of the trap, all of it at once. The river was the wall, the flood was the broom. The checkpoints weren't only robbers, they were sitting, knowingly or not, on the only surface routes to the pump stations, which meant they were unwittingly guarding the very mechanism of the drowning. And the people running the containment from somewhere central, in their quiet room, were content to let everyone east of the levee go under the water together. The sick and the survivors. Families. A pharmacist's daughter at a university that, I now realized with a cold drop in my stomach, sat on the east flats too, inside the basin. Clean, deniable. A flood during an outbreak. An act of God. Nobody to blame, and nobody to court-martial. And I was the one person Renata had found in an entire night of searching who knew how to walk into Station 6 and break the sequence at the panel. The Levee Road, the hidden route I'd just figured out to bypass the checkpoint and reach the bridge, led directly to the very station whose pumps and sluices were about to drown the whole district. The thing I knew how to do. The obscure, useless, decade-old knowledge of a pump station's intake and controls, gathering dust in the back of my head for 10 years, was suddenly the only thing standing between the East Flats and the river. If you'd been standing in that ramp, hearing from a stranger with a pistol that the only way to save the entire district was to drive toward the flood instead of away from it, would you have believed her? Or would you have decided the open bridge was worth the gamble, taken your family and left the drowning district to the people who'd built the trap? Tell me honestly. I have asked myself that question 1,000 times, and I'm still not sure I'd give the same answer twice. I have wondered, more than once, whether I should have just run for the bridge and let the river do what the city wanted it to do. I did not run for the bridge. I want to tell you it was pure courage, but it was also math, and it was also Dana. The math was simple and ugly. The bridge approach was held by armed men who would take our car, and a district that was filling with river water in 90 minutes was a district where a stolen car and 3 people on foot would drown exactly as fast as everyone else. The flood made the bridge route lethal whether or not we got through the checkpoint, because the checkpoint and the bridge approach and Station 6 were all sitting in the same low basin, and the basin was the thing being drowned. Stopping the flood wasn't the noble alternative to escape. It was the precondition of escape. We could not get out of the basin until we stopped the basin from filling, because the only way out, the Halloran, was inside the basin too. And Dana, in the back seat, with her crushed hand against her shoulder, who had spent 2 years learning the hardest lesson her body could teach her, which is that you do not get to choose your disasters. You only get to choose your response to them, Dana said quietly from the dark of the back seat. Errol's daughter is at the East Campus. He told me, against the wall. He drew that whole swarm north so we could get down the hill. And if we don't stop this, then he draws them off. And then he drowns. And his daughter drowns. And we got a clear road for nothing. She'd been listening to every word. She'd run the same math I had, faster, with less ego in it. Go to the station, Mark. We don't have anywhere to run to that isn't under 10 feet of river in an hour and a half anyway. So the decision made itself the way the real ones almost always do, not as a heroic choice between safety and sacrifice, with trumpets, but as the quiet recognition that there was only one road left, and it happened to lead toward the flood. Renata led on foot down the ramp and through the open inner gate onto the Levee Road. And we followed in the dead car, rolling because the Levee Road sloped gently downstream toward the Halloran, and the grade would carry us most of the way. The Levee Road was a revelation in the dark. Below street level, walled on one side by the long earthen back of the levee and on the other by the rear walls and loading docks of buildings. It was a hidden corridor running beneath the whole catastrophe above us. Up at street level, through gaps between buildings, we caught flashes of the disaster, the white cone of the checkpoint floodlight, the sweep of someone's headlights, once the deep orange of a building well and truly on fire throwing light up against the low clouds. But down on the Levee road, it was dark and quiet and almost entirely empty, because almost nobody alive knew it was there. We rolled along the base of the levee in near silence, and on the other side of that great earthen wall, close enough that I could feel it, was the river, a vast, cold, patient mass of water that the city was busy preparing to invite in. Renata walked alongside the slow-rolling car as it coasted, and she talked. And the details mattered, because they were the details I would need standing at the panel. So I made myself memorize every one. Station 6 had a modern manual sequence interrupt a physical procedure, not a software command, because the people who designed it decades ago, before everything ran on networks, had understood that you always need a way to stop a machine with your hands. To break a running sequence, you had to do 3 things in order. First, kill the main pump drives at the local disconnect, a big red lever handle on the main switchgear. Second, close the intake sluice by hand with a manual hand wheel, because the powered actuator would be fighting you, trying to hold it open per the central command. Third, pull the sequence controller's memory module, a green circuit board about the size of a paperback book, behind an access panel and walk away with it, so that central command couldn't simply send the start command again and restart everything the moment you turned your back. 3 steps. Kill the drives, close the sluice, pull the module. Do all 3 in order, and Station 6 would be dead. Permanently. Beyond the reach of any command from any quiet room. And the Halloran Basin could not fill, no matter what they did. But there was a problem, and Renata laid it out for me as the station itself came into view ahead at the foot of the bridge. A long, low concrete building, lit from within by the cold blue of its own emergency lighting. The only structure in the whole dark basin that still had power, because flood stations are required by law to have their own diesel generators that come on automatically when the grid drops. The problem was that the station's powered systems being live meant the station was running, and running meant loud. We could feel it now through the soles of the car, through the road, a deep mechanical thrum, the pumps spinning up, drawing the first river water through the open intake. And loud, as we had learned over and over and over that night until it was carved into us, meant the infected were drawn to it. As we rolled the last 100 yards toward Station 6, I could see them in the blue light spilling from the building's high, clear-story windows. Shapes, canted shapes, drifting in across the open ground from every direction toward the building, pulled by the thrum of the pumps, the same way they'd been pulled by Errol's horn and the checkpoint's floodlight. The station was now the loudest, brightest, most alive thing in the dead basin. And everything in the basin that could move was walking toward it. And we had to walk into it. The plan we made at the foot of the bridge, in 90 seconds, with the river on one side of the levee and the dying district on the other, was the kind of plan you make when there are no good options left and the clock is running. Priya would stay with the car at the base of the levee ramp that led up to the bridge approach engine off. Dark, ready to move the instant we came back. Dana would stay with her, because Dana's crushed hand was useless, and the inside of a pump station full of spinning machinery and drifting infected was the last place on Earth for someone who might lose the use of her legs without a minute's warning. And I would go into Station 6 with Renata, because she knew the building's bones and I knew the panel. And between the 2 of us, we might get all 3 steps done before the things drifting toward the blue light reached us and ended it. Dana didn't argue about staying with the car, and that frightened me more than anything outside the windows, because Dana always argued. It was how I knew she was okay. But she grabbed my sleeve as I got out, her good hand closing hard on my forearm. And she pulled me down toward her in the dark, and she said something I have carried with me every day since. "When this is done," she said, low and fierce, "all three of us go over that bridge together. Not two. Not me staying behind to make the math work out. All three. Promise me right now that you are not going to go in there and do an arrow." She'd seen it in me, the temptation that had been building all night, the pull toward being the noble one, the bait, the man who stays behind so the others get clear. She'd been married to me for 11 years. She knew the exact shape of my worst instinct better than I knew it myself. Knew it was sitting right there waiting for an excuse. I promised her, all three of us over the bridge, together. I meant it with everything I had. I want that on the record before I tell you how it actually ended. Renata and I went into Station 6 through a maintenance door she had a key for, and stepped into a blue-lit, thrumming, machine-stinking interior. And the noise hit me like a wall, the pumps already deep into their startup, drawing river water through the intake, the floor vibrating with it, the air thick with the smell of cold water and electric motors and the ozone tang of running switchgear. The interior was a single large hall of pumps and pipes and steel catwalks, 2 stories tall, and the control room was a glassed-in booth up on the upper level, reached by an open steel staircase, and that's where the panel was, and that's where I needed to get. We went up the stairs fast, our boots ringing on the steel, the sound swallowed by the pump noise. Through the control room glass I could see, through the station's big intake bay windows, the river side of the levee. And I could see that the powered intake sluice was wide open and water was already moving through it, dark and fast and silent under the pump roar, into the channel that fed the basin. The sequence was running. We had less time than Renata's 90-minute estimate, because the sequence had been running the entire time she'd hunted for someone who could work the panel. And now she'd found me, and the clock was whatever was left of it. I found the disconnect handle first, the big red one on the main switchgear, exactly where I remembered it. 10 years older and stiffer with disuse, but right there where the design put it. I gripped it with both hands and hauled it down, and it fought me and then gave, and the pump's thrum immediately dropped in pitch and volume as the main drives lost power and began to wind down, the great motors spinning slowly toward stop. For one beautiful second, with the noise falling away, I thought we might actually be ahead of it. Step 1, done. But killing the pumps did not close the intake sluice, and the sluice was already open, and the river was higher than the basin, and gravity was already doing the work. The pumps had only started with the sluice open. Water would keep pouring in on its own. Downhill, river into basin, pumps or no pumps. The pumps had only made it faster. To actually stop the basin from filling, I had to close that sluice, and the powered actuator that would normally close it was dead now, killed by the disconnect along with everything else, which meant I had to close it by hand, with the 6-foot iron wheel against the full pressure of the river. And that was step 2. And step 2 was down on the main floor at the intake, not up here in the control room, and the main floor was where the infected were now coming through the maintenance door we'd left open behind us. I have to slow down here, because the next few minutes were the hinge of the entire night, and I have replayed them in my head more than any other part. Looking for the door I didn't see. Renata saw them coming through the door below us before I did. She was at the control room window, and she said, flat, almost conversational, "We've got company on the floor. 4, no 6. They'd been drawn by the noise of the running pumps, and now, with the pumps winding down, the only moving, warm, breathing things left to draw them were us, 2 shapes up behind the glass. The wheel was on the far side of the main floor, at the base of the intake. To reach it, I'd have to cross that floor through 6 infected, then turn a stiff, disused iron wheel for the 2 or 3 minutes it would take to close a sluice against the dead weight of the river, and survive all of that, and then still get back up to the control room to pull the memory module so they couldn't simply restart everything from downtown. Step 3 suddenly felt very far away, up a staircase, on the other side of a floor that was filling with the dead. Renata made the call before I could even start to. She took the pistol out of her jacket, checked it with a quick practiced motion, and she said, flat and certain, "I'll clear you a lane to the wheel, and I'll hold the floor. You close that sluice, you pull that module, and you do not stop to help me. Do you understand me? Because if you stop to help me, we both die down there, and the whole district drowns anyway. You understand the math." She used my word, math. She'd heard me say it on the Levee road, and she threw it back at me now. And she was right about it, and I hated her for being right about it. She was a 50-year-old flood control supervisor with a pistol and maybe 2 magazines, and she was proposing to make herself the noise and the light and the moving thing that the infected followed, on the floor of her own pump station so that I could turn a wheel. It was Errol again. The second time that night, a stranger had offered to be the bait so that I could be the dark. And this time, I almost refused it, because I'd just promised Dana 10 minutes before that I wouldn't let anyone do an Errol. And watching it happen to someone else felt like breaking the promise sideways, by proxy. But Renata wasn't asking my permission. She was already moving down the first 3 steps of the staircase, already raising the pistol, already committed, and the first shot in that enclosed concrete space was so loud it felt like a fist against my chest. And every infected on the floor turned toward her at once, exactly as the night had taught us they would. Drawn to the muzzle flash and the crack of it, away from the staircase, clearing a lane along the far wall toward the intake wheel, I went. I went down the stairs and along the wall, while Renata moved the opposite direction across the open floor, firing measured, spaced shots, drawing them after her. And her voice was raised the whole time in a steady, deliberate stream of noise. Talking, shouting, anything, just to stay the loudest thing in the room, to keep their attention nailed to her and off me. I reached the intake wheel, and I put both hands on the cold iron rim, and I pulled. It did not move. 10 years of disuse and corrosion in the threads, and the full standing pressure of the river behind the sluice gate. And the wheel was simply frozen. I set my feet against the base of the intake housing, and I pulled with my entire body, with my back and my legs, the wrong way, the way you are never supposed to lift anything. And something tore in my right shoulder, a hot, ripping wrongness, and the wheel gave a 1/4 inch, then 1/2 inch, then 1 inch. And then it broke free of its corrosion with a deep iron groan, and it began to turn, and I turned it, and the sound of water rushing through the intake began, slowly, to drop in volume. Each full rotation closed the gate a fraction against its seat. I knew from the retrofit it needed roughly 40 full rotations to seal. I counted them out loud, because counting kept me moving through the bar of fire in my shoulder, kept my mind on the next number instead of on what was happening behind me. And behind me, I could hear Renata's pistol. And then I could hear it less often, the gaps between shots stretching out, getting longer, and I knew what the longer gaps meant. And I did not turn around. I did not turn around because she had told me not to, and because turning around would not have put a single round back into her gun. At rotation 31, the pistol stopped. I kept turning. 32. 33. There were sounds behind me now that I will not describe to you. And they were getting closer across the floor. And the wheel was getting harder again as the gate sealed against its seat and the threads bound up. And I leaned my whole torn shoulder into it. 38. 39. At 40, the water sound through the intake died to nothing. The sluice closed, the river locked out on the far side of the gate. The basin's filling stopped, and I let go of the wheel and my shoulders screamed, and I turned around. Renata was down, on the floor, in the blue light near the center of the hall. And the infected that had taken her had now, with her gone still and silent, lost their noise and their moving light source. And they were drifting, confused, swinging their heads in the sudden relative quiet of the powered-down station, hunting for the next loud, bright, moving thing. And the next loud, bright, moving thing, if I made any sound at all, was going to be me, standing 20 feet away, with a torn shoulder and a memory module still to pull. I had a choice, and it was a real one. I could leave right now. Step 2 was done. The sluice was closed, the river was locked out. The basin would not fill from the river. I could slip back out the maintenance door and run for the car and get all 3 of us over the bridge, exactly as I'd promised Dana. But step 3, pulling the memory module so that Central Command couldn't simply repower the actuator remotely and reopen the sluice and restart the whole sequence the moment I left. Step 3 was up in the control room, up the staircase, back across the floor, past the drifting dead. And it was the entire difference between stopping the flood for tonight and stopping it for good. If I left the module in its slot, then someone in a quiet room downtown could send the start command again, re-energize the actuator, reopen the sluice, and drown the district anyway the second I was clear of the building. Everything Renata had died for, undone with one command down a wire. I thought about Dana's promise, all 3 of us, over the bridge, together. I thought about Errol's daughter on the East Campus, inside the basin. I thought about the fact that the only thing standing between this entire district and the river was now whether I could cross a room full of the drifting dead in total silence and pull a green circuit board out of a panel. I took my shoes off. I did it slowly, by feel, balancing on each foot in turn, while the infected drifted, easing my heels out, setting the shoes down without a sound. And then I crossed that floor in my socks, in silence, moving through the dark spaces between the blue-lit machines, advancing only when they faced away and freezing solid when any of them turned. Exactly the way I'd learned in the alley a lifetime ago, light and motion and sound. The 3 deaths, all of them avoided one careful step at a time. It took me what felt like an hour, and was probably 4 minutes. I reached the staircase and went up it, then one slow, silent step at a time, keeping my weight on the outer edges where the steel was stiffest and quietest. And I got into the control room, and I found the access panel and opened it. And the green module was exactly where Renata had said it would be, seated in its slot. I gripped it by the edges and pulled it free, and the control room sequence lights went dark across the board. And Station 6 was truly, finally, permanently dead. No command from any room anywhere could restart it now. The basin would not fill. The district would not drown. And then I had to get back out. Across the same floor, past the same drifting things, in my socks, and back to the car, and over the bridge with all 3 of us, the way I'd promised her. I made it back across the floor. I want to say that plainly, because so much of that night was failure and loss. And this one part was not. I crossed the floor again in my socks in the dark, freezing and moving, freezing and moving. The module clutched against my chest, and I reached the maintenance door. And I went out into the cold night air. And the cold hit me, and I realized I was shaking from head to foot, and that my right shoulder had stopped being a shoulder and become a single, solid bar of pain that I couldn't lift the arm against. I picked up no shoes. They were on the floor of the station, and I left them there. I came around the side of Station 6 toward the levee ramp where Priya and Dana waited with the car. The car was there. Priya was there, standing beside it now, not in it. And when she saw me come around the corner, she put both hands over her mouth, and I understood that she had heard the gunfire start and stretch out and finally stop, and that she had been standing there, in the dark for 10 or 12 minutes, not knowing whether anyone was ever going to come back out of that building. But Dana was not in the car. For one cold, endless second, I thought the worst. That something had come down the levee road, that the dark had taken her. And then Priya, before I could even form the question, pointed up the levee ramp toward the bridge approach, and she said fast and low and scared, "She went up to look at the bridge while you were inside. She said she could walk. Her legs were good tonight. She wanted to know if the bridge was actually open before we committed the car to driving up. She's been gone 4, maybe 5 minutes. And Mark, there are people up there. I heard a voice. I heard somebody shouting." I went up the ramp. I went up it as fast as my shaking legs and dead arm would let me, in my socks on the cold concrete. And the Halloran Bridge approach opened out at the top of the levee, a wide concrete apron where the bridge met the land, and it was lit. The checkpoint people had a presence here too, or some of the same people had drifted down to it. A knot of vehicles and a portable floodlight at the bridge's mouth. And there, in the white spill of that light, was Dana. She was standing with her hands raised, her wrapped and bloodied hand held high and awkward above her head, and 2 men with rifles were facing her. And one of them was shouting the words I'd read on the pharmacy screen 4 hours and a whole lifetime ago. Elevated temperature, disorientation. He was pointing at her raised hand, at the dark blood on the towel, at the way she was standing, and I understood. With a horror that was entirely different from every other horror of that night, sharper and more personal, that Dana's MS was doing the thing it sometimes did, under extreme stress and exhaustion and cold. The thing that made her unsteady on her feet, that thickened her speech, that made her sway as if drunk. She had walked up to the bridge to scout it for us, on a night when her legs were good, and the stress and the cold and the hours had finally turned on her. Right there, in front of armed men who had been handed an instruction to refuse anyone presenting with disorientation. And they thought she was infected. I came up onto the apron shouting that she wasn't infected, that it was a neurological condition, multiple sclerosis, that I was a city engineer, and I had just shut down the flood that would have drowned every one of them, and the whole basin behind them, that the woman in front of them had MS and her hand had been crushed in a pharmacy gate, all of it, too fast, too much, my voice cracking and breaking. And the men turned their rifles toward me instead. And for one frozen moment, the whole apron was a tableau pinned under that white light. Dana swaying with her hands up, me with my hands raised and one arm hanging dead and wrong. The 2 men with their weapons. And behind them, the bridge, dark and empty and open. The way out. Right there, 50 feet away. What broke the standoff was the most ordinary thing in the world. Dana spoke. Her speech was thick and slow from the flare, the words coming out one at a time, but they were clear enough to land. "He's my husband," she said, slow and deliberate, fighting her own mouth for each word. And then, swaying, getting it out. "And the woman down there with the car is his girlfriend. And we have lived together, the three of us, for 2 years. And if you shoot any one of us, the other two are going to spend the rest of their lives telling everyone they meet that this city drowned its own east side, and then shot a woman with MS dead at the bridge. So you can let all 3 of us cross. Or you can be the men who did that." It was the exact same move she'd made on Errol the pharmacist, 4 hours and 9 miles ago, making strangers understand, in a handful of words, that we were a unit, a single thing with witnesses, a story that would outlive them. And it worked the same way, for the same reason. Because the men were not monsters. They were frightened people with rifles, who had been handed an inhuman instruction and were, somewhere underneath the fear, looking for any reason at all not to follow it. And a swaying woman calmly explaining her exhausting domestic arrangement was a reason, the best kind of reason, because nobody who is infected has ever, in the history of the world, stopped to explain anything to anyone. The infected don't make their case. They don't claim a husband and a girlfriend in the same breath. They don't think about what story the survivors will tell. The rifles lowered. The younger of the 2 men, after a long second, said, "Get the car, both of you. Go. We never saw you." And then, quieter, his voice dropping under the floodlights' hum, "And whatever you shut down back there, thank you." The river was coming up at the pilings. We were watching it climb the concrete 10 minutes ago. And then it just stopped. He'd seen it with his own eyes. The water had been rising against the bridge pilings, climbing the marks on the concrete, and then it had simply stopped climbing. While I was turning a frozen wheel in the blue dark. And he hadn't understood why until I came up the ramp shouting about a flood. I went back down and got the car and Priya. And we drove it up the ramp with the lights still off until we were past the 2 men and onto the bridge deck itself. And only then, out on the open span with the dark river far below and the lights of the surviving west side, glittering ahead of us across the water, did Priya finally switch the headlights on. Because there was nothing left in front of us to draw, nothing to summon out of the dark, just empty bridge and the way home. Dana sat in the back, her good hand finding Priya's shoulder and resting there. The 3 of us in the car together, crossing the bridge the way I'd promised. All 3, not 2. We crossed the Halloran at something close to 4 in the morning. Behind us, the east side stayed dark, and it stayed dry. The river never came over the levee. The basin never filled. Whatever had been loaded into the city's systems to drown that district stayed loaded, defeated by a torn shoulder and a frozen iron wheel, and a flood supervisor named Renata Voss, who I had known for less than an hour, and who did not cross any bridge that night, and whose body I could not go back for, and whose name I have said out loud to more people than I can count since, because somebody has to. I never found Errol. I checked in the weeks afterward, when there were lists, long lists, taped to walls and posted online, the dead and the found. His name wasn't on the lists of the dead, and it wasn't on the lists of the living, which on the east side that night was true of most names. The east side mostly became a list of the missing. But his daughter, I found his daughter. She'd gotten off the East Campus before the worst of it, on a university evacuation shuttle that crossed the Halloran a full hour before they tried to close it. And she was alive, on the west side, not yet knowing what her father had done with a panel van and a horn on a dark hill. I told her. I drove out to where she was staying. And I told her, because I thought she should know, that the only reason a clear road existed at all that night was a man who decided to be the light, so that strangers could be the dark. She cried, and she thanked me, and she asked if I'd seen him at the end, and I told her no honestly, because I never did. And I've chosen deliberately to believe that not finding him means something better than the alternative. The city never officially admitted what the flood system had been for that night. The story that got told in the press conferences and the after-action summaries was an accident, a grid failure, an unfortunate cascade of automated systems, a containment effort that thankfully held without serious loss of life on the protected side. Nobody in any meeting that I will never be shown ever wrote down the words we were going to drown the East Flats and call it weather. But Renata had seen the gate sequences come through on the district system before the comms died, and she'd told me, standing on that Levee road. And I had shut down Station 6 with my own 2 hands. And I know exactly what that basin was for. I have the green memory module still. I kept it. I carried it out of that station against my chest, and I never gave it back. And it sits in a drawer in our apartment. The apartment all 3 of us went back to. Eventually, when the East Side finally reopened months later. The apartment with the 3rd bedroom and the whiteboard on the kitchen wall. Sometimes I'd take the module out and hold it and turn it over in my hands and think about how the most dangerous thing in the city that night was never the infected. The infected were just animals, drawn to light, simple and terrible, and ultimately understandable. The dangerous thing was the decision made calmly in advance by people in good clothes who built the capacity to drown a district full of human beings and then filed that capacity under flood control, where it sat for decades, waiting for a night exactly like that one. Dana's hand healed crooked. She can't fully straighten 2 of the fingers anymore, the index and the middle, and on cold mornings she holds them curled against her sternum, against her breastbone, in the exact same way she held them under the pharmacy gate. And when she catches me watching her do it, she says, "I've had worse Tuesdays." And the 3 of us laugh every time. Because what else are you going to do with a thing like that? People ask me, when I tell pieces of this story, how the 3 of us could possibly have survived it together, an ex-wife, a girlfriend, a man in the middle, on the worst night the city ever had. And I've come to think they're asking the wrong question entirely. The arrangement that everyone found so strange, the thing I never once explained to my coworkers, the 3 of us sharing one fragile, complicated life under one roof. That arrangement is the entire reason any of us is still breathing. Because survival that night was never about being strong or being armed or being fast or being brave. It was about weather, when the gate came down on your hand and the lights marched out across the block, one building at a time. There was someone in the car who knew to kill the headlights before you even drew breath to shout. Whether there was someone in the back seat who could do the cold math you were too proud or too frightened to do out loud. Whether there was someone willing to roll a dead 2-ton weight downhill in the pitch dark on nothing but faith and a slope. It was about being a unit, a thing with witnesses, a story that outlives the men with rifles at the bridge. We were still together when the city went dark. That's the whole thing, really. When I strip away the flood and the infected and the checkpoints and the Levee road. Not the disaster. Just that when it all came down at once, we were already the kind of people who don't leave anyone behind to make the math work out. And a city that had forgotten how to be that kind of thing. A city that had quietly filed its own people under acceptable losses and built the machinery to act on it. Went dark that night in more ways than one. The East Side has lights again now. I drove through it last week, slow, on a gray afternoon. Past the strip mall with its new tenants, past the pharmacy with its new security gate. past the self-storage facility and the road behind it that drops down to the levee. The access ramp gate is closed now and powered. A steady green light glowing on the controller, working exactly as designed. Station 6 has been rebuilt and repaired and brought back under proper district control, with new modules and new locks and, I'd assume, new procedures about who can run a sequence and from where. From up on the bridge, it looks like any other low concrete building down by the water. Unremarkable. The kind of thing you drive past your whole life and never once think about. But I know what it can do. And I know what it almost did. And every single time I cross the Halloran, I look down at the dark water on the upstream side. Sitting there flat and patient behind the levee, held at exactly the level it was held at that night. Kept out of the basin by a closed sluice and a system that someone, somewhere, in some quiet room I will never see, still has the capacity to reverse. I keep the module in the drawer. It's the only piece of all of it that I'm truly sure they can't restart.